I'm going to read here from Philippians chapter 4. Now, I'm excited. You know why I'm excited? Not only because we're eating together. I brought a real Bible. I felt like, you know what? I want to get this thing out.
I was going to grab mine.
Man, you need to do that. I'm going to take a picture of you and put it on Facebook. All right, so this is the easy reading King James, which it takes out the tither, hither, whither, and yonder, but it keeps the integrity of the text. All right, so this is a wonderful translation. What I love about this translation, two things, is when the prophets are speaking, when the word of the Lord comes to the prophets, it's written in red because it's Jesus speaking. So when he gives the law to Moses, it's written in red. This is an epic Bible. It's the first thing I ever bought my wife, ever. My first gift to my wife. And I was really slick, right? So you know what I did? I wrote Sarah on it, but I didn't write her last name because I was going to have it changed. And I knew what I was doing. All right?
Good job.
So, and, all right. Philippians chapter 4. All right. Now, therefore, my brethren, dearly beloved and longed for, my joy and crown, so stand fast in the Lord, my dearly beloved. In this one verse, he tells them he loves them twice. Right? There's a deep love and affection that this man has for these people. It's profound, it's deep, and it's authentic. And now he's going to get into some stuff here. Watch this. I beseech Euodias and I beseech Syntyche that you be of the same mind in the Lord. What is he saying? He's calling people out by name and he's telling them to be of the same mind. What does that mean? They're not of the same mind. What does that mean? There's a disagreement going on that could cause division and could create a problem. So instead of ignoring it, Paul confronts it. People have this idea that if we ignore problems, they're going to go away. I promise you, if you ignore problems, the only thing they're going to do is grow and possibly multiply. The longer you wait to confront something, the bigger it gets. So he is cutting this off, before it gets crazy, but he's naming them by name. So he starts by saying, hey, guys, I love you. I really love you, right? He tells them he loves them twice in the same sentence. And then he names people by name who have the potential to hurt what God is doing within the church at Philippi. All right? Be of the same mind in the Lord. And I entreat you also, true yoke fellow, help those women which labored with me in the gospel, with Clement. Clement later went on to be the bishop of Philippi. Also with other fellow laborers whose names are in the book of life. That's a very interesting, the word book of life. We're gonna get into the meaning of that. Verse 4, rejoice in the Lord always, and again I say rejoice. Let your moderation or your gentleness be known to all men. The Lord is at hand. Be careful or anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God which passes all understanding shall keep your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of a good report, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise, think on these things. Those things which you have both learned and received and heard and seen in me, do, and the God of peace shall be with you. Verse 10, but I rejoice in the Lord greatly, and now at the last your care of me has flourished again, wherein you are also careful, but you lacked opportunity. What that means is, he was saying, you guys wanted to care for me, you guys wanted to help me out, except I was doing well and I didn't need help. You lacked opportunity, right? In other words, he goes, I know you guys were concerned about me, but there was nothing you could do because I didn't need anything. So he's telling them that he understands their affection, their love, and their care for him, but he also realizes that at that time in his life and in his ministry, he didn't have needs. Specifically, he's talking about financial, which you're going to see as we continue. Not that I speak in respect of want, for I have learned in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content. I know both how to be abased and I know how to abound everywhere and in all things. I am instructed both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ which strengthens me. I'm gonna do the first 13 and then we'll do the last 10 because it's 23 verses. Now, what's interesting here is in verse 1, Paul tells the Philippians he loves them twice. In this verse, he tells them that they are his crown. Now, the word crown there is the word wreath. It's basically what athletes would get when they won a competition in Greece or in Rome. When they would stand on the podium, they would put a wreath on their head, and that means that they won. And so he defined his crown. Paul's crown wasn't how many people were in his church. His crown wasn't how awesome his website was, right? His crown wasn't how busy his schedule was, how many books he sold, but his crown was people. He finishes the verse by telling them to stand fast in the Lord, which means to be stationary or to persevere. Too many believers want to bear fruit, but don't want to grow roots. Verse 2, Paul gets specific in this verse. He names two women who are having some differences. Their differences were affecting the body, so he addressed them publicly in his letter to the church. He tells them to be of the same mind. Now, he says this word here that this is what I wanted to get at. He says this word in verse 3, I entreat you also, true yokefellow, help these women which labored with me in the gospel. Now, we don't understand what a yoke is. You might know what a yoke is. You know what a yoke is. He's from Haiti. So a yoke is this, it's a wooden bar, and it goes like this. And basically, they put two oxen, and they put them together, and they plow the field together. And so now the oxen, they're dragging this metal thing that kind of just tears up the ground while these oxen plow. Now, what's fascinating about the way they do this, and they did this in the old culture, and they still do this in agricultural societies today, is they do not put two young oxen together. They put an old oxen and a young oxen together. And here's what happens. The young oxen is really excited, has lots of energy, and he wants to go 100 miles an hour. And what the young oxen does is it burns itself out, and then it relies on the experience and the strength of the old oxen to keep plowing through. So it's like a person who has passion but doesn't have wisdom. It's like a person who's excited but doesn't know what it is to have endurance. It's like someone who has the ability to take off and run down the block, but they can't run 7 or 8 miles. They can't pace themselves. They're excited and they burn up and burn out, but then they're yoked to another oxen who has experience and who's strong and who the excitement of being whipped in the rear end and basically told to go has worn off. And so these older oxen have learned to pace themselves, and they have learned to move forward with consistency, not just with spurts of energy, right? And you see this in the kingdom because who was Paul with? Paul was laboring the gospel with Timothy. What was Paul? An old man, a wise man, an experienced man, a man who'd been shipwrecked, stoned, left for dead, beaten up, betrayed, everything that you could imagine. And he was his yoke fellow was Timothy. Remember in Philippians he said, I don't have anyone like-minded except you. So they were true yoke fellows. In other words, they were moving together in the kingdom. And Paul had learned how to endure. He had learned how to persevere. He had learned how to be strong. And so he wasn't living out of excitement. He was living from endurance. Now, what he says is, listen, guys, these women labored with me in the gospel. Help them. He's talking about money. help these women who labor with me in the gospel. So you can't labor in the gospel silently, right? Hello? So it seems that as if what Paul written in Timothy and in other places in Corinthians is not consistent with what he's saying here. And why that is because when he's talking to the Corinthians, he tells the women to shut up and keep quiet in church. And people like really religious people use this because religion always tries to oppress women and children. We see it with Islam today. We saw it with Judaism in Jesus' time. Religion is always trying to oppress the weaker. And so what happens is, Paul here is saying, these women, they labored with me in the gospel. They co-labored with me in the gospel. They were fighting the same fight that I was fighting. In other words, we were together in the advancement of the gospel. And he's telling them, what is Paul doing? Paul is using his apostolic influence to basically have people help these women because of the work these women did with Paul. Right? Are you with me? So sometimes people have this misconception that, like, can women lead? He is saying that these women were yoked with him in the gospel. What does that mean? That means they were equals. If you're on the same yoke, if you're plowing the same field, what are you? Equals. This is important. All right. I entreat you, he says. Also, true yoke fellow, help those women. Entreat means I request. It also means the word interrogate. And he calls them true yoke fellows, which means legitimate. For something to be proven legitimate, it has to be tested. He's saying, hey, these women are the real thing. They labored with me in the gospel. The word labor there means to wrestle. Wrestle. Like these were feisty chicks. They strived together for the gospel. They were aggressively pushing the gospel forward. They were aggressively using their power and using their strength to bring Jesus to people who didn't know him. So Paul is using his influence for their benefit. That's another sign of what leaders who have the right spirit do. They use their influence for someone else's benefit. Those women who labored with me together in the gospel. Paul here, okay. Paul, now this is another thing. Paul says that their names are written in the book of life. Now that's bold. That's really bold. Now the word there, book, is this word in Greek called biblos. It's where we get the word Bible. That's where we get the word Bible. Their names are written in the book of life. Now, I don't want to get too into the book of life, but Jesus said, don't rejoice because you can cast out demons. Rejoice because what? Your names are written in heaven. Right? Now, Paul says their names are written in the book of life. The word life there is the word Zoe. It's the Greek word Zoe. That's why we named our daughter one of the, Zoe. So that's the Greek word for life. So their names are written in the book of life. Now, in the book of Revelation, John sees the book of life, but it's not just the book of life. It's the Lamb's book of life. So there is a progressive unveiling of this book that is in heaven that has people's literal names written in it. Now, Paul had this revelation more than 30 years before John saw the Lord on the island of Patmos. And so you have Jesus who's saying it like 60 years previous. And then now Paul is seeing this book that Jesus spoke about. And then John sees the real details of the book, that it's not just the book of life, but it's the Lamb's book of life. Revelation is progressive. It's important to know that. Paul is clear. He was totally 100% assured of their salvation. Think of that. The same guy who said, walk out your salvation with fear and trembling. He said, he was nervous that he himself would be a castaway. Right? So he took salvation. It was not just this thing like, oh, you just take it lightly. This is a serious thing, right? Are you following me? Are we together? Right? Now, this man is 100% assured that their names are written in the book of life. This is infallible. This is true. This is not for debate. This is what he's saying. It made the scriptures, and it's just true. So it's really interesting. No other religion in all of the world gives you an assurance of salvation based on the merits of another. So you have guys flying planes into buildings in hopes that when they wake up, they're going to wake up in paradise. You have other people who will sacrifice and they'll live in monasteries their whole life. People will walk up thousands of stairs on their knees. People will mortify their flesh, will do all kinds of things with the hopes that they'll be saved, not realizing that the only religion in the world that gives the assurance of salvation is not a religion. Because I don't go based on my merits, I go based on Jesus' merits. If it was based on my merits, I would die and go straight to hell. Because I have sinned, you have sinned. So it's important to understand that what we believe that is found here is the only system of faith in all of the world that I get in based on the merits of someone else. It's important to know. That's what grace is. Grace means I don't earn it and I don't deserve it. It's a gift. It's important to know. 4. Paul, from a Roman jail cell that was literally attached to Caesar's house, tells the Philippians to rejoice in the Lord always. The guy is in jail and he's telling them to rejoice. Now, I understand that what Paul is actually saying to them, it's real. He had real results. Acts 16, 24 through 26. It's midnight. Paul is praying. Silas is praying. They're worshiping. They're thanking God. And the jail cell begins to shake and breaks them loose. So when a guy like this says, rejoice in the Lord always, he has results in what he's talking about. He's not talking some sort of theory, some sort of religious concept, something that he heard at a conference, something that he read in a book. This is real life. They were thankful to God that God counted them worthy to suffer for the name of Jesus. It's midnight. They should be complaining. They should be asking to be set free, but they're praising God, and God sets them free. They didn't allow their circumstances to dictate their climate. Rejoicing in the Lord brings real results. Verse 5. All men should know that we are gentle because we live with an awareness that the Lord is at hand or that the Lord is near. So basically, my understanding of the Lord's presence in my life, Emmanuel, God with us, right? My awareness, your awareness, our awareness as a people should affect how we treat others. So I should be gentle, and I should be, in New Jersey language, I should be easy with people. Why? Because the Lord is at hand. What does that mean? I live with an awareness of Him, which means it matters how I treat you. Why? Because you're created in His image and likeness, and the way I treat you reveals how I feel about Him.
Wow.
Our awareness of the Lord Jesus must affect how we treat people. Friends, enemies, family, those closest to us. It's not easy, but it must affect it. Verse 6, be anxious for nothing. This is a command, not a suggestion. The scripture says that the law came through Moses, but what? Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. So what that means is that when Jesus says something, when the Scriptures command something of us, before God told us to do it, it was impossible for us to do it. When He told us to do it, what was impossible then becomes possible because He told us to do it. Does that make sense? So His words are full of grace. Grace is the empowering presence of God to do with God what you could never do without Him. And what does truth do? Truth sets us free. Now, free to do what? Free to obey Him. Free to walk by faith. Free to wholeheartedly love Him. Free to love people. Free to forgive our enemies. Free to love ourselves. Free to walk in His ways. Free to obey Him, right? So truth, He comes full of grace and full of truth. So when He says, be anxious for nothing, the God who is commanding this of us is also empowering us to be able to do that which is pleasing to Him. Now, Paul doesn't just tell them how to pray. He doesn't just tell us how to pray. Paul doesn't just tell us to pray. He tells us how to pray. He says, worship and pray and give your requests or your petition to God with thanksgiving or gratitude. That doesn't mean we don't ask for more. It just means we are thankful for what we have. So while I'm asking for more, I could be asking for more in a place of anger, frustration, disappointment. How many of you been there? Hello? How many of you been there this week? Right? But now He's saying there's another reality that God is empowering us to live by, and that reality is this, that we can make our requests be made known to Him with worship, which means we adore Him and we reverence Him for who He is. And also with prayer, right? And with requests. So that means that I acknowledge Him, I reverence Him, I come to Him because of who He is, and I tell Him and I ask Him what I need and what I'm desiring and that's perfectly okay. So it's critical how we approach Him. It's like if your child comes to you and goes, I'm hungry. What are you going to say? No, I'm not going to feed you. Starve. You wouldn't say that to your children. But if your kid goes, I want this right now, you're going to say, whoa, slow down, slugger. Right? You're gonna, because you can't feed that. Because if you feed that monkey, you'll be visiting him in jail. You don't want to feed that. So you've got to cut that off early, young and early. So, we can approach God with our needs, but we must remember to approach Him with gratitude, with thanksgiving, with He gave us life, right? We didn't, you didn't choose to be born. You didn't volunteer to have the parents you have. God chose you. You, with no power in and of yourself, brought yourself here. You did not ask to be born, and you did not ask to die, and you are here, and you will die. That's the God factor. Now, verse 7, and the peace of God, which passes understanding, shall keep your hearts and minds through Jesus Christ. What does that mean? Well, the word peace of God that passes understanding, it means that passes is the word superior. So peace is superior to understanding or intellect. If you need to understand your circumstances, you need more peace. God does not owe any of us an explanation. Think of that. God does not owe me an explanation. Sometimes we approach God as if God owes us an explanation, and He doesn't. He's God. Now, peace transcends logic and reason. I'll give you an example so you catch a visual. Remember Jesus, he's sleeping in the storm. His disciples wake him up and go, don't you care that we're dying? And he's sleeping in the bottom of a ship. And they go like, don't you care about us? And he goes, why are you afraid? And then he says to the storm, peace, be still, and the storm stops immediately. Right? You cannot speak to the storm that you cannot sleep in. If you can sleep in the storm, you can speak to the storm. I'm going to say that again. If you can sleep in the storm, you can speak to the storm. What does that mean in real life? It means that if you lose your peace, you surrender your authority to bring influence and change to the circumstances you find yourself in. My wife and I, we were invited to some that thing with all these politicians. And they lost our car keys. And they hit my wife's car. And we got soaking wet in the rain. and people are looking at us and going, why aren't you upset? And my wife, I'm gonna put her on blast here a little. She was almost getting upset, which she never gets upset. It's usually me. And I looked at her and I said, you can never lose it in front of people. You lose your right to influence them if you give your peace away. And they were looking at us going, what's different about you? Jesus. Now, this is important because here's what, every time you see Jesus doing a miracle in the Gospels, he's always from a place of peace. Jesus is not neurotic. He's not pacing back and forth going crazy. He's just from a place of peace. He just says, okay, lame guy, stand up and walk. He goes, all right, go get the water pots, pour water in them, and bring some of the water and bring it to the governor of the feast. Like, he's really like chill, he's calm, because he knows God, he knows what God is like, and he knows that he can take his relationship with God to the bank in real life. So he's not like anxious. Why? Because he has peace. So where there is not peace, there's anxiousness, or there is fear, whatever. Let me explain to you what happens when peace is not there. When we don't have peace, we say hurtful things to our spouses, right? We react instead of respond. When there's not peace, we can get depressed. We can get angry too fast, right? We have to wind up saying we're sorry 40 times because we surrendered our peace. So if you can hold on to your peace, you can hold on to your relationships. Your relationships will be as good as your ability to hold on to the peace that God gave you.